Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So last week I did my Artillerist build for the Artificer. A couple weeks before that, I did a couple builds for the Battlesmith for the Artificer. And the only thing I haven't done a build for yet is the Alchemist. And the reason why I hadn't done a build for the Alchemist is because, honestly, I'm not quite sure what they're supposed to do in combat. I've talked about that before. In fact, I talked about it in last week's video, and that got some responses. One of the responses was asking if there must be some way we can make the Alchemist effective in combat. Are you sure there's no way you can do it? Another comment I had was from somebody who had been playing an Alchemist, and they found it frustrating because, of course, in combat, they're not really a full spellcaster. You have half casting, so you have lower level spells. You don't have a whole lot of slots, even though you aren't using anything above first level slots on elixirs. You still just don't have a lot of spell slots to be using in combat. And number three, elixirs are just not something you can use in combat. Now that's something else. I had another comment from somebody who thought that maybe if they got a rogue with 3 levels and then went into Alchemist, they could use fast hands to deliver elixirs as a bonus action. Now, although you could potentially deliver an elixir as a bonus action, you wouldn't be able to administer the elixir as a bonus action. And that's because, according to the rules on elixirs, you can't administer an elixir to somebody else unless they're incapacitated. So if somebody's down, potentially you could deliver an elixir as a bonus action. That even in itself is a little bit vague because delivering an elixir isn't defined as a use an object action. So it's not entirely clear whether fast hands would allow you to do it as bonus action, but even if it did, that's only for incapacitated creatures, which means most rounds of combat you just can't do that. You can't give an elixir to somebody else, whether you use your action or a bonus action. So what do you do in combat? How are you effective in combat? And that brings me to the final comment I want to mention. This one was from Joey Kneecap. He said, "What I don't get, and I'm happy to be proven wrong here, is why does every class have to contribute in combat? It's not like the fighter or barbarian get to contribute that much when it comes to utility tasks. Why must everything be equal all the time? Can't some characters be great at certain things, while others take a back seat and shine some other time? I don't get this at all. Might be because I'm getting older." So that is a fair point. Do all characters need to be effective in combat? And I would say definitely not all characters need to be effective in combat. I play in a campaign right now where there is a player who's deliberately made a character that is not effective in combat. This character is somewhat insane, and they just kind of attack randomly in combat. Half the time they're hitting party members instead of enemies. And the DM is aware of that character and aware of the effect that character has on party effectiveness and has adjusted challenge ratings accordingly. And as it happens, that player has fun playing that character. And the rest of the group kind of has fun with, I guess, the comedic aspect of that character. So we're all having a good time. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that this person plays this character that happens to be terrible in combat, happens to not really contribute to combat effectively in any way at all. But here's the thing. That player has chosen to play a character not effective in combat. And they're playing a class that could be effective in combat, but it is easy to take any character class and make it bad in combat. You can simply make decisions that make you ineffective in combat. But the thing is that we all have fun in different ways, and I think if you're having fun playing D&D, great. And if you're having fun playing a character that's not effective in combat, great. But even if every class can be effective in combat, that player still gets to play the character they want to play, and they still get to have fun in the game. But if we are going to respect that everyone has fun in different ways, and everyone deserves to have fun at the table, then we also have to consider that some players want to be effective in combat. I'm one of those players. I want to feel like I'm contributing effectively to combat. It doesn't have to be in delivering damage, but in some fashion. I think of it kind of like being on a team, like a soccer team. And then again, I'm a nerd, so let's not use soccer. Let's say I'm on a chess team, and we go to a tournament. Do I want to be the player that always loses and brings the entire team down? No, I don't like that. I don't necessarily need to be the best player on the team, but I want to feel like I'm doing well enough that I deserve my spot on the team, that I'm contributing. I get something from that. It makes it more fun for me. So I think if we're designing a game where everyone has fun in different ways and we want everyone to be able to have fun, then it makes sense to make character classes so that they all can contribute to combat. Because frankly, combat is a big part of the game. Yeah, it's true, there's certain classes that probably contribute less outside of combat. But I don't think there's such a thing as a class that doesn't contribute outside of combat, or is ineffective at contributing outside of combat. That barbarian might be very useful in kicking down that stuck door. They might be very useful in picking up that gate that nobody can lift. Maybe they have a background that has skills that can be used. Or maybe as a barbarian, they're good at things like tracking because of their survival skills. There are many ways that every class can contribute outside of combat. And there is many ways that every class can contribute inside of combat, with the exception of the Artificer Alchemist. In fact, it's unique in that way. I mean, I've already shown how you can make a 20 level Beastmaster, which is arguably the subclass that was worse before this, and still be able to deliver effective damage in combat. But with the Alchemist, I can't do it. So, is there any way to salvage the Alchemist? And the answer is, yeah, well, it is easy to salvage the Alchemist. If you want to be effective in combat, it can be done, but you have to multi-class now. I mean, my baseline damage is just a Warlock using Eldritch Blast, raising their Charisma, using the Hex spell, and the Agonizing Blast Invocation. Technically speaking, if you make a Charisma-based character, or a character that begins with a 16 Charisma, raise your Charisma at levels 4 and 8, take Agonizing Blast at level 2, and the Hex spell at level 1, then you can take a second level Warlock, and then you can multi-class it into anything, any class at all, do 18 levels, and you'll meet the baseline damage. In fact, you'll meet the baseline damage exactly. I mean, technically speaking, with an Artificer, if you were to do an enhanced arcane focus for that Warlock, you could potentially even exceed the baseline damage. So it can be done. It can be done easily. What's the way we can do it with the least amount of multi-classing? Well, according to my calculations, the best way we can do it is to go a little bit off-road here and go with a level of Fighter and make a melee Alchemist. Now, normally, when I make a character, I do concept first, and then I do a build around that concept. And in this case, again, it feels a little weird to me, but I went the other way around. I thought about effectiveness first, and then thought of what concept could fit that effectiveness. And what I thought in this case is maybe our alchemist has used elixirs to become really big and strong. If we look at Pathfinder, this is built into the system. I actually much prefer the Alchemist in Pathfinder. I think it has tons more flavor than the D&D Alchemist. But if we were to take an idea from that, they have a thing called a mutagen, where they drink it and they become big and strong. Now in D&D, we don't have mutagens. But then again, maybe we can just fit that into the concept. Maybe this character has, years ago, developed a form of mutagen that's permanent. And now they're just big and strong and tough. But they're still an alchemist. Can we work that into a character concept? Well, I think we can. And if we look at how that works, we can meet our baseline damage. So I'm going to show you how to make that build today. Let's get started. Okay, so here is our character, and we're going to call him Alex R. Man. You get it? Okay, we're going to keep on our Eberron content so that we can access the Artificer. Now we're going to go into our race, and what we'll do with our race here is we're going to pick the human. We're going to want that feat at level 1, so the variant human is the way to go here so that we can be effective right from level 1. Now, in terms of starting language, you can pick whatever you want. This guy, I figure, if I'm fitting with the concept, he has been dealing in some dark magics. So we're going to give him Abyssal, I think, to start. And then our ability score increases. We're going to increase 2 ability scores. The first one will be Intelligence. and then the second one will be strength. And this is going to be a strength-based character, but we're not going to ignore our intelligence because a lot of the artificer abilities are based on intelligence, and we don't want to ignore those. Then we're going to get our starting skill, and this character, I'm going to give him athletics because he's going to be a strength-based character. This is going to be a guy who bashes down the doors and that kind of thing. And athletics is going to be what we want for that. And then we're going to get our starting feat, and this is important. What you need to take for your starting feat, and this isn't overly flexible, is Magic Initiate Wizard. And then we're going to choose 2 cantrips and our first level spell. So what we're going to take as our 2 starting cantrips are Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade. That's going to give us a little bit of flexibility in their use because ideally what we want is to be able to get that secondary damage as often as we can. And then by taking both these, that's going to give us a better chance of that happening. And remember, with Magic Initiate Wizard, we're basing this off our intelligence, and Green Flame Blade is based on our intelligence. So it is, again, advantageous to us to have that good intelligence. And then our first level spell is going to be Find Familiar. And you probably know what I'm going to do here. We're going to be using Find Familiar to do the help action. That's going to give us advantage on our attack roll with our Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade. And when we do that, it is going to increase our damage significantly. Then we're going to go into our class, and we are going to need to multi-class this character. I have not found a way to make the Alchemist effective with damage with a straight class. And I worked on it a fair bit, but there doesn't seem to be a way to do it that I was able to find. But I can do it with a 1 level dip. And the only way I found to be able to do it with 1 level dip is we are going to go with Fighter. So that Fighter class at first level is going to do some important things for us. It's going to give us martial weapon proficiency, which we're going to need. It's going to give us heavy armor proficiency, and we are going to want to use heavy armor with this character. Medium armor isn't going to cut it. I'm going to show you why. And also it's going to give us a fighting style, and that is going to increase our damage as well. Now we're going to get 2 proficiencies. We already have athletics, but we're going to definitely want intimidation with this character. Though we're not going to be a charisma-based character, so our intimidation isn't going to be great, but it's just appropriate again for the concept. And then we're going to choose another skill, and you know I like to start with perception, so let's start with perception with this character. Then we're going to choose our fighting style, and the fighting style we're going to take is Great Weapon Fighting. Now what Great Weapon Fighting does is when you make an attack roll and you roll a 1 or 2 on a damage die from an attack you make with a melee weapon that you're wielding with 2 hands, you can re-roll the die and must use the new roll, even if the new roll is a 1 or 2. The weapon must have the 2-handed or versatile property for you to gain this benefit. Now, when I did my calculating average damage video, I didn't discuss how Great Weapon Fighting affects damage. So I'm going to just very briefly explain now how that works. Normally, if we want to determine the average result of a die, so a d6 for example, you would just take half of 6, which is 3, and add a half. So 3.5 is your average result on a d6. But if we have the fighting style, we have to remember that if we roll a 1 or a 2, we'll be re-rolling. If we re-roll, then the average result of the re-roll will be 3.5. So what you do with a greatsword is for each d6, when we determine our average, what you need to do is you need to take all the possible outcomes and divide it by 6. So you take 1, and that would become an average of 3.5. You would take 2, which would become an average of 3.5. You would take 3, which is an average of 3, 4, which is an average of 4, 5, which is an average of 5, and 6, which is an average of 6, add them all together, and divide by 6. And if we do that with 2d6, our new average damage for a great sword, instead of being 7, as it normally is, becomes 8.3, or 8.3 repeating, if you want to be technical about it. But essentially, we're looking at about 1 1/3 extra points of damage. This also is vital for us to be meeting the damage we want to meet here. And when we're looking at great weapon fighting and you do the math, you're going to find that a great sword or a 2d6 weapon is going to deliver more damage with that than we're going to get from, say, a d12 weapon. So now let's go into our ability scores, and we're going to do a point buy here. Point buy is going to also be vital for this build because we want to have a strength of 16 and an intelligence of 16. That's the only way to do it. So we're going to take our 15 intelligence and our 15 strength, It's going to give us a 16 in each ability score. Then, if we're going to be in melee, we don't want to ignore our constitution. So we're going to make our constitution 14, and that's going to at least give us a decent amount of hit points. And if we have a good armor, we're going to have a decent armor class on top of that. So defensively, we won't be in terrible shape. Then we only have 2 points remaining, and you can go ahead and put them in dexterity, wisdom, or charisma as you choose. I'm going to choose dexterity just because I don't want to have a negative on my initiative modifier. As we go into our background, I'm thinking this character is a character who has studied alchemy, both the good and the bad. They will be somewhat amoral in regards to using elixirs. Some of the elixirs they will be used for good, but they've also used elixirs that have mutated themselves into something huge and unwieldy. So I'm thinking Sage would be appropriate for somebody who's done that kind of research, and that'll give us Arcana and History, both based on our intelligence, and we have a good intelligence score, so that works out well. And we're going to get 2 additional languages. And then maybe we've looked at Infernal, and maybe we've looked at Celestial. So then we've looked at a variety of outer planar kinds of magics. Then we're going to go into our equipment, and it is good that we're going to be able to choose the fighter starting equipment. It's going to work much better for us. We're going to want chainmail, that's heavy armor. The reason we want heavy armor is because we couldn't afford to have a good dexterity. And if you can't have a good dexterity, heavy armor is the way you want to go because it doesn't involve a dexterity modifier. So we can have a good armor class despite the fact that we didn't pump up our dexterity. Then we can have either a martial weapon and a shield or 2 martial weapons. This is going to be a great sword user. So I'm thinking we'll go with the 2 martial weapons, grab our great sword right off the bat, and then we can choose any other weapon. And I would think something that could be used at range would be a good idea. But because we are a strength-based character, we're not going to be great at ranged weapons. We're okay with thrown weapons. But maybe what we'll do is we'll take something like a net. It's going to give us at least another interesting option to do in combat. Then we can take a light crossbow and 20 bolts or 2 hand axes. We'll take the hand axes because they will be based on our strength if we wanted to throw a weapon. And then we can pick a Dungeoneer's pack or an Explorer's pack and pick whichever you like. They're both reasonably good for an adventuring character. Then we get our various Sage stuff, and we're going to add our starting equipment. Now I will note that this character does not begin with Tinker's Tools. This character does not begin with Alchemist Supplies. So we're going to need to pick those up at some point because you are going to definitely want those for your character. Now the Alchemist Supplies, we have some time because until we get to level 4, we won't be an alchemist technically. So Tinker's Tools is really the only thing you're going to really need to pick up. And you can pick it up anytime because we're not an artificer yet. So I don't really need to tell you how this is going to be effective at level 1. We are a first level fighter. We have second wind if we take some damage and we need to pick it up, but otherwise we have an armor class of 16, which is a decent armor class for first level. 12 hit points isn't bad for first level, and our great sword does good damage, 2d6 plus 3, but remember we're working off an average of 8.33, so it becomes 11.33 average damage. But the other thing that affects that is that we have taken the Find Familiar feat and the Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade cantrips. And if we give ourselves advantage using the Find Familiar spell, and we're using Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade, and we assume that maybe we can get that secondary damage about half the time, and it's hard to say exactly how often that's going to happen. I usually estimate about half the time. Then we can actually deliver really good damage at level 1. Now, I will say, as I said, I looked at ways to make the Alchemist effective in combat, and just the standard way you would think to do it is you take Alchemist and then you grab Firebolt, which would probably be the most damaging cantrip you could pick, and then a Homunculus to boost your damage a little bit more. And what I saw was that according to the baseline, we delivered significantly below the baseline at level 1, at level 5, level 11, level 17. It just gets worse and worse and worse as we move up in level. And this wasn't a surprise to me. Then I looked at the possibility of getting a familiar and using the familiar to give me advantage on that Firebolt spell. Now, one thing I should mention too is with the Alchemist, if you want to take advantage of Alchemical Savant at level 5, which boosts your damage, you have to cast through your Alchemist supplies. That means that with an Alchemist, we can't even take advantage of our own infusion enhanced arcane focus, because the arcane focus can't be used with alchemist supplies. So you have to choose. Do you want the bonus to hit, or do you want the bonus to damage? So that is almost ironic that as a cantrip attack user that is an artificer, you can't use your own ability. But what I saw is if we took Find Familiar, we could increase our damage to get closer to the baseline. But as you can see, we still end up below the baseline at all levels. And although at level 1 it's close, it just gets worse from there. But if we look with the Greatsword build, our level 1 damage is fantastic. 12 compared to a baseline of 6, we're delivering over double the baseline at level 1. Again, this is not a surprise. We have made a fighter. We've given them advantage in attacking with a Greatsword using great weapon fighting. We would expect to be able to deliver a lot more damage than the baseline, and we can. Now, what we can see with the build that I'm going to be showing you is that at level 5, at level 11, at level 17, we're going to remain above the baseline, but the gap closes. So what we see is at level 1, this is a fantastic performer. Level 5, it's still a good performer. And then by level 11 and 17, it's an okay performer. So although this build does deliver the baseline or above the baseline throughout the career of this character, it is going to perform best at lower levels. So just keep that in mind. If this is a build you want to try sometime, this is one of those builds I would really look at playing in one of those campaigns that's not going to go to a super high level. And then you're going to find that you are effective in combat at all levels. And remember, we're only doing a 1-level fighter dip here. So for the most part, you're maintaining your alchemist abilities. So now with level 2, we can become an artificer. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add 2 levels because not a heck of a lot happens for us at level 1 with artificer. But at level 2, things begin to happen that are actually going to help us in combat as well as our spellcasting. So when we look at our class features, obviously we're getting hit points. We're going to get a little bit less because we have a D8 instead of a D10. And as I mentioned with magical tinkering, we need to get those tinker's tools, which we should be able to do easily enough by this level. It's not that big an investment. The big thing that happens for us here is infuse item because we can help ourselves. So if we're going to be a little bit selfish here, we can begin with an enhanced weapon, and this has been built into my calculations. We're assuming that the greatsword we're using is the weapon we're going to enhance. Now with our other option, as in the option that we're actually going to have active, we have a couple different ways we could go. We could either buff another party member or buff ourselves further. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume we buff ourselves further, in which case what we're going to be doing is take enhanced defense and use it on our armor. That will give us an additional +1 armor class. And because we're in melee combat, using a big weapon, it's reasonable to think we might be targeted with attacks, and enhanced defense is really going to help us out. Then we're going to pick 2 more infusions, ones that we probably won't have active most of the time, but at least we'll have the option of making them active. So the first one I'm going to take is an alchemy jug, just because I think it's appropriate for an alchemist. And the alchemy jug, if you haven't heard of it before, it's from Tomb of Annihilation. And it's kind of a neat thing where you can create various liquids each day. And you can make things like mayonnaise or poison or just strange things with an alchemy jug. It's a neat item, and I think it's appropriate for this character. And then the second one I'm going to take, surprise, surprise, bag of holding. So the bag of holding, of course, is always a useful utility item to have access to when you need to. So now we're going to pick our first 2 cantrips. Now this character actually doesn't really need the mending cantrip until much later, because the mending cantrip would be used to repair our steel defender if we had one. We don't have one. It would be used to repair our cannons if we had one. We don't have one. And it could be used to repair our homunculus, and we will have that, but that's a ways away. Nothing we need to worry about right now. The first thing I'm going to grab then is guidance, which I've talked about a million times, is a great cantrip. And then we're going to pick 1 additional cantrip, and the one I'm going to pick is acid splash. That's going to give us a ranged option, and the reason I'm going to pick this over firebolt is mainly just I think it is a little more fitting for an alchemist. You hurl a bubble of acid. Well, I figure our alchemist is going to hurl a vial of acid. And then we can choose one or two creatures in range. They make a saving throw. If they fail their saving throw, they take a d6 acid damage. It's not great damage, but this will be boosted by our alchemical savant when we get to that level. And if we hit two creatures with it, both will get the additional damage from our alchemical savant. So it kind of is optimized from that perspective. Now, our first level spells, remember we are a melee character, and as a melee character, I really like absorb elements. I mean, I like absorb elements anyways, but if we use absorb elements, it also improves our weapon damage. I haven't worked that into any of the calculations because you don't know when you're going to be using absorb elements, but it's just one of those things that occasionally is going to give you a little bit more damage with your weapon. Now the thing I'm going to take is Fairy Fire. I've talked about Fairy Fire before, and there's not a lot to add here, except it's probably not something I'm going to be casting a lot, just because most of the time in combat, I'm going to be going and hacking stuff with my greatsword. But Fairy Fire, when we have a bunch of enemies that are clustered, is probably worth our action, because we can grant advantage on all of them. Now, we potentially have advantage already with our familiar. But one thing that is always pointed out to me is familiars can die, and if your familiar dies, you're going to lose that advantage until you can cast Find Familiar again. Fairy Fire is another way we can grant advantage, and then we don't necessarily have to involve our familiar in combat. Also, we're giving advantage to all the other party members as well. So if a bunch of enemies are clustered, I still think a Fairy Fire is a good way to go. Now I'm also going to grab the Sanctuary spell with this character, because I will be using my action in combat, but unlike other Artificers, I don't have a lot to do with my bonus action. Eventually I will with the Homunculus, but that is a long ways away. And Sanctuary will give us a bonus action casting. That is reasonably useful. If we cast it, we can cast it on ourselves, we can cast it on somebody else, and it makes them more difficult to attack. Final spell I'm going to take, Detect Magic, so that way we have a ritual we can cast and it's not going to use any of our spell slots. So if we look at our third level character here, I'm still assuming Chainmail, but very possibly we've moved up to Plate Mail. It really depends. Plate Mail is really expensive, but sometimes you just find it, or sometimes you have a little bit more money. So our armor class might be higher than this, but assuming Chainmail and assuming we're enhancing our Chainmail, we can get to an armor class of 17. Then our Greatsword with the additional +1, we're going to have a +6 to hit for 2d6 +4 damage. And again, we're re-rolling those 1s and 2s. So the damage remains pretty good here. Now let's look at this character once we become an alchemist. So we are going to get the alchemist spells at this level. That is going to give us Healing Word and Ray of Sickness. Healing Word, of course, is another bonus action spell we can cast. So we can do this in addition to our Greatsword attack. And eventually, once we get to level 5 as an alchemist, Healing Word will get a boost. Ray of Sickness, probably not something I'm going to cast a lot. Flaming Sphere is going to be a significant damage boost for this character, and I didn't work it into the damage calculations. And the reason I didn't is because we don't have a ton of spell slots, and we didn't need Flaming Sphere to meet the baseline. But if we do use Flaming Sphere, our damage goes up again. And then Melf's Acid Arrow again, I'm probably not going to use. 9th level, Gaseous Form is mostly utility. Mass Healing Word is actually quite good for an alchemist, because again, we're going to get that bonus from Alchemical Savant, and it's going to be added to the die roll, which affects multiple creatures. Then at 13th level, we get Blight, not a spell I'm fond of. Death Ward, which is a reasonably useful spell. And then 17th level, Cloud Kill. That's a problematic spell because we're talking about poison damage. Poison can be a problematic kind of damage. And Raise Dead, which is a decent spell, though frankly, at level 17, someone's going to be able to raise dead in your party besides you. Then we get what is the main ability of the Alchemist, and that's the Experimental Elixir. So beginning at 3rd level, whenever we finish a long rest, we can create an elixir. All we need is an empty flask, so you're going to want to have lots of empty flasks on hand. You have to use your alchemist supplies, which we will need to have by this point. One nice thing about Experimental Elixir is we can create more as we gain levels. So once we get to 6th level as an alchemist, we can create 2, and 3 once we get to 15th level. Now when you create your elixir, the effect is random. But if we expend a spell slot, we can create another elixir and then we can choose the effect. Now, I would be thinking that at some point we might want to be using all our first level spell slots on elixirs. But let's take a look at the elixirs and see what kind of ones we're going to want to have. The first one is healing, and this is the one I would consider kind of the standard because essentially we're making a healing potion and it delivers 2d4 plus our intelligence modifier. So that's going to be similar to a healing potion. And when we get to a higher level, it's going to be more effective. But essentially, we can create a healing potion with a first level slot. That's okay. It's not amazing. Frankly, healing word is not going to deliver all that much less than a healing elixir. And once we have 5th level alchemist, healing word will probably deliver more healing than a healing elixir. And they're both using a first level slot. So keep that in mind. Maybe we don't want to spam all our first level slots on healing. The second one is swiftness. Walking speed increases by 10 feet for 1 hour. That can be really effective or entirely useless. It's completely circumstantial. It's kind of like the Longstrider spell. The third one is resilience. They get a +1 bonus to armor class for 10 minutes. That's something we might even want ourselves. We have a 17 armor class. That would boost us to an 18 armor class. And 10 minutes isn't a bad duration. +1 AC is good. It's not amazing. And I would point out that first level spells can give you a bigger bonus to armor class. But this isn't using our concentration. So +1 AC without concentration for 10 minutes, I'd say is reasonable for an elixir. Fourth one gives us boldness. Drinker can roll a d4, add the number rolled to every attack roll and saving throw they make for the next minute. So this is almost like a focused bless spell without using concentration. And my issue with this one is the duration. That 1 minute duration means we pretty much need to know we're going into combat before you drink it, because I don't think it's worth drinking on your first round of combat. So I'm not sure how much I like boldness. If I know I am going to be able to get the drop on an enemy, or I know I'm going to go into combat, a d4 makes a big difference, and I would love to have it. But the fact that I don't know when I'm going to need it, and often we're going to end up in combats where I'm not going to be able to use it, it kind of sours this one for me. The fifth one is flight. So any kind of concentration-free flight is good. My issue with flight is the speed. You get a flying speed of 10 feet. So if you are going up against flying creatures and you think this is going to allow you to get up to them, it's not. Any flying creature is easily going to stay out of your flight range. The only real use I can see of this flight is number one for utility. So if you have the time to fly over that wall or whatever, and if we're using it in combat, I can only really see using it in defense. So if you are, for example, in a combat and maybe you're using ranged attacks and the enemy can't fly, then flight of 10 feet is still useful because you don't have to go up very high to get out of the range of those melee characters. So I will say that flying speed of 10 is a big downer, but I can still see flight being useful some of the time. And then our final one is transformation. The drinker's body is transformed as if by the Alter Self spell. That's going to give you things like the ability to breathe water. It can change your appearance. It can give you claws that are just terrible. So it's an occasionally useful utility spell, and that's about it. Not something I'd probably want to spend my first level spells on. So now the question is, how good is an experimental elixir? Because what I hear over and over again are ways to get more elixirs, and that this is going to make the alchemist effective. Well, the first thing to note is that this isn't stuff that you're going to be doing in combat most of the time. And the healing effect is probably worse than a first level spell you already have. So I'm honestly not sure how many of these I want to actually spend my first level slots on. Certainly, I would probably spend my first level slots on in many ways, just because it's handy to be able to hand out healing potions. Then somebody else can use their action to deliver it to somebody who's incapacitated. That can be useful sometimes. Some of these are useful utility, and that might come up. I would probably want a flight available, but again, these aren't amazing for first level. Let's just keep that in mind. If you want to keep your first level spells and just cast them on spells, I don't necessarily think that's a bad option. So how does this affect our character in combat? Well, it really doesn't very much. The elixirs, again, they're just not something I'm going to be using in combat. They may occasionally be effective in combat, especially if we can use them beforehand. Something like boldness, if you roll it, if you have a chance to use it before combat, it's great. It's just something that if you don't know the combat's going to happen, I don't see how you're going to use it. So in the end, after taking Alchemist, our character really doesn't change in combat very much at all. Artificer helped us out because we can get some infusions, uh, but with the Alchemist, we're going to get some elixirs, and those might be useful, especially things like healing potions can always be useful, but they're not going to be massively impactful, in my opinion. Now I want to start hitting the checkpoints, the points where I showed you the damage that this character can deliver. So if we go to level 4 with Artificer, that is going to be level 5 as a character altogether. And what happens at level 4, of course, is we get our ability score improvement. That's really the main thing that happens. And what we want to do here is we're going to take Great Weapon Mastery. And Great Weapon Mastery, of course, gives us the ability to take that -5 to hit to get the +10 damage. And when you can do that with advantage, which I'm assuming we're going to be able to do with our familiar, it ends up being a significant amount of damage. And it is, again, vital for this build so that we can maintain our baseline. The other thing to note is whenever we score a critical or reduce a creature to 0 hit points with our weapon, we get to make a weapon attack as bonus action. As I mentioned, there's not a ton of things we're going to be doing with our bonus action. We might cast a Sanctuary, we might cast a Healing Word, but beyond that, there's not much to do with our bonus action. So any time that we can get an extra attack, that's fantastic. And unlike some other bonus action attacks that are tied to doing the attack action, which we're not doing, we're never using the attack action, we're always using a cantrip instead. So when we use this, it isn't tied to the attack action, so we get that benefit. Now we get one additional first level spell. Again, we're probably having no problem using up all our slots. And if we're not using them all on spells, then we have elixirs we can create. So this is a good point to pick a ritual, and we'll pick the alarm ritual. So two things happen at this level that improve our ability in combat. The first is Great Weapon Master. Of course, we can occasionally make a bonus action attack. I didn't calculate that into the damage at all because you don't know when it's going to happen, but it is definitely something that is going to increase our offense. One thing I did calculate into the damage was the ability to take that -5 to hit for the +10 damage, which is normally going to be a good risk for us. Because we're attacking with advantage, our chance to hit is still going to be pretty good even when we take that -5. The other thing that happened that I didn't talk about yet was our cantrips scaled, and that means that our Green Flame Blade and our Booming Blade both deliver more damage. They now deliver damage on the initial attack, and if they do the secondary damage, that has scaled as well. So those cantrips are now delivering more damage for us, and that's essential because we're not getting extra attack with this character. So those cantrips are a big part of the reason how we can maintain damage above the baseline throughout the career of this character without ever having an extra attack. So what I want to do is touch on the various snapshots I took of this character on damage. So we're at level 5 now, and I want to show you what it looks like when we hit level 11. So when we hit level 11, that will be level 10 as an Artificer. Now when we hit level 6, we probably wanted to change our enhanced weapon to Radiant Weapon, but then once we get to level 10, we want to change it back to enhanced weapon because that's going to give us a +2 to hit and damage. At level 6, we're going to take Homunculus Servant, and that gives us now something to do with our bonus action. It doesn't do a ton of damage in combat, but if we have nothing to do with our bonus action, it just makes sense to use that and get a little bit more damage. Now there are other people in combat. Maybe somebody has a shield. I could see a repulsion shield being very useful. Then we're going to pick a couple of level 10 options. And the first thing I'm definitely going to want to do is get wing boots because again, the flight speed that we get with our elixir is terrible. But with wing boots, we can have a good flight speed. So if we need to fly in combat to take on flying enemies, wing boots is going to give us that. Now the other item that we can create, I'd be tempted to give to somebody else. If we're not doing the repulsion shield, maybe somebody else will get use out of, Gauntlets of Ogre Power or Eyes of the Eagle or Cloak of Protection. It really depends on who's in your party. One of the main abilities that an alchemist gets is Alchemical Savant. This comes into play at 5th level of Alchemist, so that's going to be 6th level for this character. And what it allows us to do is whenever we cast a spell that restores hit points or it deals acid, fire, necrotic, or poison damage, you get a bonus to damage equal to your intelligence modifier. But I think it is also important to note that whatever you cast must be cast using your alchemist supplies. And I talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about infusions. This prevents us doing some things. One of those things is it prevents us from using this when we're doing something like a green flame blade, because green flame blade is not using alchemist supplies as the material component. So therefore, you can't get this bonus. It pretty much limits you to only alchemist spells. Also note, this isn't going to help our elixirs at all either. So for this character, I primarily see this being of use when we cast healing spells, because most of the time we're not going to be doing spells that deliver damage, but if we are at range and we use our Acid Splash, it would give a bonus for that. Now, Flash of Genius comes in at 7th level. Definitely a good ability. It's going to be a little less effective for us because we're not boosting our intelligence here. And when you're not boosting your intelligence, then your Flash of Genius falls behind a bit, but it's still a good ability. We're going to be able to use it 3 times to deliver a +3 to an ability check or a saving throw. And at level 8, we are going to get an ability score improvement, and we're going to raise our strength here. So again, we're really focusing on maintaining that ability to contribute in combat. And again, it's kind of necessary for this build. Fortunately, there's not a huge amount of things that are reliant on our intelligence right now. And our intelligence is still a 16, so it's not a bad intelligence. So going with our strength here doesn't make us bad at spellcasting. Now at 9th level, our elixirs got better. And this does definitely change some of the comments I made at 3rd level when you first get those elixirs. Because now whenever a creature drinks an experimental elixir you've created, the creature gains temporary hit points equal to 2d6 plus your intelligence modifier. It's going to be about 10 temporary hit points most of the time. This is big because now all those experimental elixirs just got a lot better, but they still only require a 1st level slot. So this is the point where I would say it's definitely worth it to just spend your 1st level slots, get all those elixirs. I mean, you get, say, healing potions with your elixir. You're not only restoring hit points, but throwing temporary hit points on top of that, and that's just good. And then we can cast Lesser Restoration without expending a spell slot or preparing the spell. We can do that a number of times equal to our intelligence modifier each long rest. Now, we didn't raise our intelligence, but that's not really a problem here, because the chance that you're going to need to cast Lesser Restoration more than 3 times per long rest is very, very low. Quite often you won't get a chance to use Lesser Restoration at all. That's not uncommon. And that's one of my problems with this ability is that they picked something really circumstantial. I would have preferred to have seen maybe a Cure Wounds spell here or something we could definitely use. But Lesser Restoration is really useful when you need it. So it's good to have. But again, I wouldn't expect to run out of uses. And Magic Item Adept, of course, is good. I've talked about this with all my Artificer builds. Being able to attune 4 items, it's hard to quantify how good that is, but it's really good. And also we can now craft our own magic items of common or uncommon with a quarter of our normal time and half as much gold. Now we are going to get an additional cantrip and we will pick up the mending spell at this point because we now have the homunculus. When it comes to 2nd level spells, remember we do have the flaming sphere always prepared. We might use that sometimes. But with this character, I would think that Enlarge Reduce is a very flavorful spell that I could see this character using, simply because it kind of fits again with our concept. Our concept is that this character used alchemical means to make themselves into big and strong, and Enlarge Reduce is a way we can kind of enhance that even further. And it increases our damage, and Enlarge increases damage by d4. It's not a lot, but there's also, of course, utility uses for Enlarge Reduce as well. The other spell I'm going to take is Blur. Because this character doesn't use a shield, their armor class is going to be okay, but it's not amazing. And their hit points are okay, but they're not amazing either. So if we find ourselves taking a lot of damage in combat or going up against something we know is going to deliver a ton of damage, it would be worth concentrating on Blur to prevent getting hit. The final spell I'm going to pick up is Tiny Servant. Um, I already have a familiar with this character. That familiar's actions are already accounted for. Tiny Servant will be a way that once we get our spell storing item, we can have something use that spell storing item that can concentrate on spells, and it's not going to interfere with people's actions in combat. So I think it's a good choice for us here. And we don't have a ton of this level slots. Otherwise, something like haste is a reasonable option here too, but I didn't calculate haste into any of the damage calculations. If you want to use haste here, it would absolutely improve your damage. So at level 11, what happens is, remember we've scaled the armor class bonus from our enhanced armor. We've scaled our weapon bonus from enhanced weapon. So our greatsword's looking at a plus 10 to hit for 2d6 plus 6 damage. And remember, our cantrips have scaled again at 11th level. So both Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade are delivering more damage on your base attack and on secondary damage. Now with this character, I would imagine I want to use healing. And I've got Healing Word that I can use with the bonus action. And I have Mass Healing Word that I can use as a bonus action. Now, technically speaking, our Homunculus also takes our bonus action. And I did calculate the Homunculus into the damage. But the Homunculus damage, it adds about between 2 and 3 points to your average damage per round. So if you want to use your bonus action on something like a Mass Healing Word, it doesn't affect your damage a huge amount. And remember, our Mass Healing Word is going to get the bonus from our Alchemical Savant, so it is going to heal more damage. So we're going to take a look at our final snapshot here. So that will be having the Artificer at level 16, and the overall character level will be 17. Now with 14th level infusions, I'm pretty much always going to recommend getting Replicate Magic Item because there's a lot of good stuff you can get here. If we want to give this to somebody else, we can give them a lot of great stuff. But if we want to use this for ourselves, something like an Amulet of Health could really boost our hit points. So I'm going to go ahead and select that for this character. The other thing I'm going to select for this character is a Gem of Seeing, which can be circumstantially a fantastic item to have availability for. At 11th level, we're going to get our spell storing item, and I mentioned already we've picked Tiny Servant specifically to make use of our spell storing item. This will use our bonus action in combat, so this would be instead of, again, using our homunculus in combat. But again, that's not a big sacrifice. And the spell I would be putting into that spell storing item is almost certainly web. I think that's the way to go here. And then you can have your Tiny Servant deliver a web, costs you a bonus action, then your Tiny Servant will be the one who's concentrating on it. We are going to get 2 ability score improvements. And the first ability score improvement is going to go to Strength, and that will max out our Strength at 20. And then the second one we're going to do is we will go back and we will start raising our Intelligence. Now, if you take this character to level 20, you can still get your 20 Intelligence. In this case, this is going to bring us to an 18 Intelligence. At 14th level, we get our Magic Item Savant. We can attune up to 5 magic items at once, and we can basically use any magic item. And then we get our essentially what is our capstone for Alchemist, and that's Chemical Mastery. And we gain resistance to acid damage and poison damage, and we're immune to the poison condition. And again, I think it fits with this concept of this character being this kind of permanent Mr. Hyde, this alchemically mutated character. And then we can cast Greater Restoration and heal without expending a spell slot, without preparing the spell, and without material components, provided you use your alchemist supplies as spellcasting focus. And both Greater Restoration and Heal are great spells, and definitely improves our ability to be support in terms of healing and curing for our party. Now this particular character at 17th level is still not going to have 5th level spells. Once we get 5th level spells at level 18, then Animate Objects is going to improve our damage significantly if we use it. So just keep that in mind that if you progress this character past level 17, we're going to see a boost against the baseline whenever we use Animate Objects. But what we will have is Death Ward. I think that's a good thing for us to use. Blight is not great, and I probably wouldn't use it very much. But Arcane Eye is a great spell, so I would probably grab that as one of them. And being that we're looking at this character largely as support in terms of healing and curing when party needs it, I think Freedom of Movement is a good pick for us here. Because again, this is one of those things that we don't know when we need it, but when we need it, it's really useful to have. I would also pick up the haste spell at this point. That would definitely give us a method for which we can improve our abilities in combat. Again, this does require an action to cast, and although you can make an attack, you can't make an attack using your attack cantrip on the round you cast it. So if you use haste, just be prepared that on the first round of combat, you're going to take a penalty to your damage, and then on following rounds of combat, you'll deliver more damage. Again, fitting with the idea of this character will eventually get raised dead. Don't have it yet. I can see picking up Revivify, again fulfilling the idea of the concept of this character. And we get a final cantrip. Maybe when things are really far away, we might get advantage out of having a Firebolt available. So at level 17, we're going to get a number of different advantages. We can use our bonus action to deliver a web spell, and then we have our Tiny Servant, concentrate on it. We're getting a lot of spells now that are really helping with our ability to be support in combat. So somebody goes down, we can cast Revivify on them. Somebody needs a greater restoration, we have that. Somebody needs a lot of hit points restored, we can cast a heal spell. We have our mass healing word. It's delivering more healing as well because of our alchemical savant. So in terms of healing and helping the party when they're in trouble, this character has a number of things it can do. Now, the reason I don't think that's good as a concept by itself is there are a lot of rounds where you're not really going to have anybody to heal and nobody really needs any restoration. And then what do? Well, this character now has something to do. This character can smash things with its greatsword. So we can choose to be a damage dealer, or we can choose to be that healer when it's required. And that's generally the way I think it should be with healers. We already have classes that are good in support. Druid is a great example of a class that's great in support, delivering healing and curing as needed. But Druids can also be effective in combat. I think it's important for the Alchemist to also be effective in combat because healing just doesn't come up all the time, and on its own, it's not an effective role in combat. And delivering crappy cantrip damage, I don't think is enough to make it viable for this class. So I do think this is one option of a way that you can make this viable. Now, again, if you want to take 2 levels of Warlock, that can work too, but it will also put you a level behind in your Artificer levels. So that is the end of this build, Elixir Man. And if you found a way to make 20 levels of Alchemist effective on its own, I'd love to hear it in the comments section down below. This is the best I could do, 1 level of Fighter and then Alchemist after that. Now next week, what I'm going to be doing is taking a look at something else Eberron, the double-bladed scimitar. And we'll see what we can and what we can't do with the double-bladed scimitar next week. And until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers, and I'll see you next week.